Hello everybody, my name is Meg Ray, and in this video I'm going to be showing you some basics for how you can render your Minecraft build in Blender. I'm not going to go into too much detail, I'm just going to run through some basics for how you can import it and render it out. So the first thing you'll need two programs. Obviously you'll need Blender, but you'll also need to get the program Mineways, and both of those are 100% free. I will provide links for those in the description in case you don't have them already. Once you have those downloaded, you're going to want to open Mineways, and in here we're going to open our world so that we can export our build for rendering. So we're going to go to File, Open World, then open whichever world it is that has your build. Once you're in your world, you're going to navigate to whatever it is in your world you like to render. I have so many things in this world, but I think I'm going to render this angel statue that we've made. So I'm going to right click and drag around this object to select it. If this window pops up, you can just push OK, and now you can see that everything we have selected is highlighted in purple. And right now you can see the grass is highlighted in purple too, which means it's selected. But I don't want to have my grass selected, I just want to select my object. So what I'm going to do is go up here to this lower bar and raise this to 4, and now our grass is no longer selected and only our object is highlighted in purple. So once we have it selected, we can save it out by going to File and Export for rendering. Navigate to wherever it is you would like to save it. I'm just going to save this on my desktop and name it Angel. And save. The next thing you'll see is this dialog box. Most of the things in here are going to be the default settings. Some things you want to make sure you have checked are the full color textures. You want to make sure that that is checked. And in this box here, you could leave it at the default settings, but if you did want to change the material of a subtype, for example, if I had a build that had multiple colors of glass, but I wanted to give each color a specific material, then I would want to check this and split it into subtypes, meaning the different colors of that block. I'm not going to get into materials with this tutorial, but in case you did want to do something like that later on, then that's what you would do. And in the physical materials, you're going to want to make sure it says Sculpteo Multicolor. And the only other thing I ever change is the size, and you could resize it once you're in Blender, but sometimes it takes longer to load if it's too big, so I'm just going to lower this to 100. And then I'm just going to push OK. So now that we have our object exported, all we have to do is import it into Blender. Once you open Blender, you're going to see a scene that looks like this with an object, a light, and a camera. So the first thing we're going to want to do is delete this object. We're just going to click on it and delete. And before we do anything else, we're going to go switch our renderer up here from Blender to Cycles renderer, since that's what we'll be using. It's very important that you have your renderer switched before we import, otherwise you won't be able to see your textures in Cycles. Now we're going to go to File and Import and go to this wavefront.obj. Then you'll just navigate to wherever it is you save that object file. You will see two files that are saved here. The MTL is the textures for your file and the OBJ is the actual object. So go ahead and select the OBJ and then import. Now that we have our object in our scene, we can push S to scale it to whatever size we want. It really doesn't make much of a difference for this particular build because it's so small. I'm just going to leave it like that. So now all we have to do is set up the scene with our lighting and our camera in order to render it. As you can see, we don't have any textures on our object right now. It looks completely white, and this is just because we're in object mode. But if we do enter preview mode by pushing Shift Z, then you will see our textures are indeed there. They're just not visible in our object mode. The first thing I want to do is adjust the lighting for our render, and if I push Shift Z, you can see what it currently looks like. It's a little bit dim, so we are probably going to want to brighten it up a little bit. Go ahead and select your lamp, and then over here on the right, let's go to our lamp settings. You can see we have several options. Right now it is a point lamp, but we also have sun, spot, hemi, and area. They all do different things, but for this one I'm going to do a sun lamp. But you can spend as much time as you want messing around with the different lamps and their settings to try to get the results you want. So now I just need to move my lamp around so that it's angled and hitting my subject from the angle I want it to be. You can move it around easily by dragging it along these axes with these arrows. Another way to do this would be to push G and middle click, and then dragging it to whichever axis you want to move it along. The same thing applies for rotating. If you wanted to do that, you would just do R and then middle click and drag to whichever axis you want to rotate it on. I'm just going to keep messing with this rotation until I get to something that I want. I think I just want it to be hitting it more from the side. Now let's go ahead and look at the preview and see what that looks like. Okay, so it does have a little bit more of a shadow right here. If you look over here in the properties panel, we can also adjust settings to our lamp. We're just going to click on use nodes and we can adjust the strength and the color and the size of our lamp. So you can just mess around with these settings as much as you want until you get something you're happy with, and you can always see what it looks like over here when you're previewing your render. So just for example, here's what it would look like if I changed it to something blue to a cooler color. I'm not a huge fan of that, but that's what it would look like. So let's change this back to white, because I like the white light better. And let's try a different brightness just to see what happens. So if I made this really high, you can see everything is very washed out and very bright. So I'm just going to keep messing with this until it gets something I'm satisfied with. Actually, it didn't look too bad to begin with, but I might make it just slightly brighter than that. So we're going to go with 2. Now, since we are casting shadows with a sun lamp, it's going to give us some pretty harsh shadows that you can see on this side. So what I want to do is add a second lamp to kind of help soften those shadows so they're not so dark. So I'm going to do Shift A and we're going to add an area lamp. So now that I have my lamp in here, I'm just going to move it around and rotate it to wherever it is I want it to be facing the angel. And then we're going to have to enter preview mode so that we can see what it's looking like. And as you can see, it is softening our shadows a little bit, so this is looking a lot better. If I were to adjust the strength to, let's say, 50, then the shadows would be a little bit darker. And just for fun, I want to change the color of this light just to see what it looks like. So let's try a dark blue light and see what that looks like. Okay. It looks a little bit strange. It's not hitting it at quite the right angle, so I'm going to adjust this again and adjust the rotation. So it will be hitting more of the front angle instead of just the direct side. So let's push Shift C again to preview it and see what it's looking like now. Okay, that looks a little bit better, and I'm going to leave it blue just because I think it looks a little bit more interesting. But I'm going to lower the strength to just 10, so there's just a light tint of blue, and maybe make this blue a little bit brighter. Okay, so now I have my lights set up how I want them. Now I just need to adjust my camera. To do this, we're just going to enter our camera view, which is done by pressing the 0 on the numpad. And as you can see, this is the camera view that we have right now, but we don't want to render it like this. So I'm going to push N to open up this side properties panel, and I'm going to scroll up and find this lock camera to view and check that. And what this does is we can just move around like normal inside our window here, but it would also move our camera with it. It's the easiest way to adjust your camera's position, but you could also move it just like you'd move anything else inside of Blender. I just like to be able to see what it looks like as I move it. So I'm just going to mess around with the position until I get somewhere that looks good to me. And once I'm happy with the position, I'm going to check that box again to lock my camera in place. Okay, doesn't look too bad. I think I'll just leave it here. So now I have everything set up. I have my lights set up and my camera set up. By the way, if you did want to exit camera view, you can just push numpad 0 again to get out of there. But now I'm going to show you how you can add just a simple gradient background to your image. I personally tend to render things without a background and then add one in later on with Photoshop. That way I can just change the background as much as I want without having to re-render the entire image. But for the sake of this tutorial, I will show you how you can add a gradient background directly inside of Blender. So click on this little world over here to enter your world properties, and then under surface, we're going to go to this color option and change this to a gradient texture. And if you look at our preview right now, you can see we don't have a gradient, and that's because we need to add some additional nodes so that we can customize it and make it show up where we want it to show up. So go ahead and open a separate window, and we're going to open our node editor in this window. And once you're in the node editor, you're going to want to make sure you're in your world, so go ahead and make sure that world is clicked on the bottom. And you can see the current nodes that we have in our world, but we will need to add a few more. So I'm going to do Shift A and search for a texture coordinate to start, and then we'll also need to add a mapping and a color ramp. And to plug all these in, you're going to want the color ramp in between the gradient texture and the background, and on the texture coordinate we're going to plug in the camera to the mapping and then the mapping into the gradient texture. So now that I have everything plugged in, I'm gonna try to explain what each one does. So the texture coordinate is just what it sounds like. It tells when you will be able to see the full gradient, and in this case we want to see the full gradient in our camera view, so that is why that is selected. And then there's the mapping, which does exactly what it looks like it does, where you can adjust the position and rotation of your gradient. And I'm going to go ahead and rotate mine to 90 degrees so that we have a vertical gradient. There we go. And the gradient texture is pretty self-explanatory. You can change the different shapes of your gradient, but we're just going to keep it at linear. And over here in the color ramp, of course, we will be able to change our colors. I'm thinking I want to make my gradient like a golden sky, so I'm going to change this color to something blue. Yeah, that looks good. Then I'm going to select my other color and change this to a golden yellow. That looks pretty good. So once you've messed around with your background and you have it to your liking, now we're ready to render. I'm going to enter my render properties by clicking on this little camera over here, and you can see we have a whole bunch of properties. I'm not going to go into great detail explaining each one, but some of the more important ones are your resolution. This will be whatever size you want your image to save out as, and right below it you'll see a percentage which will tell you what percentage of that resolution it will be saving out as. So if you want a really high quality image, you're going to want that to be 100%, but for the sake of this tutorial I'm just going to leave it at 50%. A little farther down you can adjust what type of files you're going to be saving it as and how many colors you want to be using. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail with how each of these works, but the most important thing is your sampling. So let's click on the sampling tab, and as you can see right now in our preview, it's rendering only at 32 samples, and you'll see that it's really noisy, especially in this shadowy part right here. But when we do the final render, we're going to be using more samples, and hopefully it will clear up a lot of that noise. So I'm just going to set my final render to, let's try 300 samples, and we'll see if that looks okay. But if your image is looking extra grainy, then you can always just up your samples, and hopefully that will fix it. I don't really need to change anything else for what I'm doing, so I'm going to go ahead and push this little render button, and we'll watch it render. This one's going to go pretty quickly just because I don't have my settings super high. My resolution is still only at 50%, but if it were 100, it would take longer. And there is our final render, not too bad. If you're happy with the render and you don't want to go back and change anything, then you can save it by clicking on this image and then doing save as image or pushing F3. But that is all I'm going to show you guys for today. We did some of the basics from how to import your object in, how to add some lights, and how to adjust your camera. Again, I know I didn't go into a lot of great detail, but there are loads of tutorials out there if you ever had something specific in mind that you're trying to accomplish. I'm still learning Blender myself, so if you found anything in this video that was helpful to you, then please be sure to leave a thumbs up, and I will see you guys some other time.